Dr. Ekberg, why do you think insulin resistance is the biggest health problem facing the world today?
Because the majority of people on the planet have some degree of it. So officially, they set the rate, like prediabetes is defined as a 5.7 A1C. But to me, if you're at 5.5 A1C, you're kind of slipping. You're on your way there. If you're not stable and healthy and insulin sensitive at an A1C of 5 to 5.3, if you're above that, chances are that you're kind of slipping and on your way up. And I think there's like 30-40% of the US population is officially pre-diabetic, but there's like 80% who are in that slipping zone. And around the world and around the globe, I think we're talking 60, 70, 80% of the world's population have some degree of it. And prediabetes is basically what they say is if you don't change things in your life, in your lifestyle, then you'll probably have diabetes in 5 to 10 years. That's why they call it pre-diabetes, because if you don't change, you'll probably get it. So what that means is we're looking at an epidemic here for the world where most people on the planet are heading to that stage. And it's not about diabetes, it's about metabolic poor health that leads to cardiovascular disease, that leads to stroke, that leads to dementia, and basically everything else you can think of gets worse with insulin resistance. So that's why it's the number one health problem. And we've never seen anything like it on that scale where the majority of the world has something.
Let's talk about the mechanism, what people are doing, and then the underlying physiology as somebody walks into this.
So we're designed for feast and famine. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. They had seasons, they had growing seasons, they had probably more food in the summer than they had in the winter. So we had a way of putting on weight, of storing fat as a reserve for the winter. And same thing on a shorter scale, if we hunted a woolly mammoth or we were lucky, we got some good results from a hunt, then they would eat as much as they could, and then the body would store the excess as fat. So the next 3-4 days, when they may not have as much, then the body could pull off of those resources and burn that fat for energy until the next meal. But the problem is we are never short of a meal anymore. And then in addition to that, we stopped eating food. We started eating candy and drugs, because basically everything with sugar in it is a drug. It's extremely addictive. And everyone knows that if you eat a big fat steak, then you're going to be full for a long, long time. If you eat a bag of potato chips, then you're still hungry an hour later. And the same thing goes with virtually any processed foods or any cookies or a soda. Anything with sugar and anything with processed grain in it, it is very, very, it's satisfying in an addictive way, very short term. But then you're hungry a couple hours later, and now you go eat again and again and again. And I've often used the analogy of a pantry. So the purpose of a pantry is to put something in so that you can take it back out, right? And that's what our ancestors did. They ate, they put some reserves in fat storage, and then the next few days or over the winter, they retrieved it. But we just keep, with the analogy of a pantry, we just keep shoving things in there, and we never ever take anything out because there's never a shortage. And that's the mechanism. So there's two factors that influence this this overload. And one is the type of food. So we eat sugar, we eat processed grains. That's going to create a blood sugar response that's much, much higher and an insulin response that's much, much higher. The other factor is the frequency. That if you eat a big steak, you're going to eat, or similar whole food, you're going to eat maybe twice a day. With processed foods, you'll be tempted to eat all day long. So it's the amount of the insulin response and the frequency of the insulin response. And over time, that overwhelms the cell. The cell wants food, but when you try to force feed it, it's going to start saying no. It's going to start resisting that force feeding. And that's what insulin resistance is. Now, when insulin comes knocking, the cell doesn't respond. It's resistant to the action of insulin.
Let's continue the story. So over time, the body's going to make more insulin, trying
Correct.
to get that fuel into the cell.
Correct.
Then what happens?
Yeah, so when the cell starts resisting the fuel, now the body gets real nervous. The brain says, hey, I don't like the high blood glucose. I have to keep the glucose at a steady, low, comfortable level. So when it gets higher than that, now the body, like you said, it releases more insulin, and the cell becomes more insulin resistant, and the cell releases more insulin, and so on and so on. So this is how the body has to keep the glucose down, but it does it at the expense of working really, really hard and producing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times more insulin than a healthy person. So now we have those chronically high levels of insulin that start doing damage on its own.
Early on, you talked about A1C. Let's bring that back in and explain that takes a certain period of time before we start seeing a change there.
Yes.
Because of this increased insulin that's coming in, bringing blood glucose down. So the A1C is such a late marker to what you're talking about here.
Glucose, yes. Glucose and A1C is a late marker because it could be 10, 15 years before it changes significantly. And A1C is basically, it's a type of protein in the red blood cell. And glucose is sticky. So glucose and protein tend to stick together. And once they find each other, they don't let go. So then we can go and measure how many percent of this A1C protein has glucose stuck to it. So that's basically the number that we get on the test. And there is a big difference between 5% A1C and 5.7 or even 5.5. And this measurement, because we're measuring the amount of sugar stuck to a protein in a red blood cell, the time period that we're talking about is how long a red blood cell lives, which is typically around 100 days. That's just a ballpark number. Some people say 90, some say 120, but you figure it's 3 months average of your blood glucose. So once you start making changes in a positive direction, the A1C is going to lag behind because it's not going to show you until 3 months later where you really are.
The point I want to make sure we highlight, though, is that if somebody's just looking at A1C, destruction can be happening in the background for 10, 15, 20 years before blood glucose actually starts to rise and the A1C goes up.
Yes, yes. And I actually did a dedicated video to that I released this morning that's pretty interesting. It talks about 10 different things that you can notice before your blood sugar rises that are due to insulin resistance. So you're absolutely right that the way I want to emphasize is you can't measure a controlled variable. Okay, glucose, it's super important for the body to keep it steady. If it goes up, the body releases insulin to bring it down. If it goes down, we have counter-regulatory hormones to bring it up. We have glucagon, we have cortisol, adrenaline, growth hormone, to make sure that we don't fluctuate. So the body has these wonderful systems where we can eat food and we can go without food for days, and that blood sugar is not going to change much, right? So measuring blood glucose doesn't tell us a whole lot because the body is working so hard at keeping it at that level. It's not showing us what's going on, and it's only going to change significantly after the whole regulation system basically fails. When it's worn out, when it's fatigued, when it has no more resources or tools to put into the fight, now we're going to see that blood glucose go up, which is why it's so crazy that they're measuring glucose and they're not measuring insulin. Insulin is the factor that shows us how hard is the body working at trying to control this glucose. So measuring the glucose makes no sense because it's not supposed to change.
And to highlight another point here too is that if you're waiting for that blood glucose to rise, insulin being chronically elevated is causing health issues.
Correct.
If you get to the point where that blood glucose is starting to go up and you've been pushing it for 10, 15, again, 20 years, blood glucose being elevated is going to cause a whole nother slew of problems.
Yes. Yeah. So once the system fails and you see these blood glucose levels, like diabetic is defined as 129 or 125 or whatever. But once you're there, a lot of people will have 200 and 300 in blood glucose. And what happens now is you change the characteristics of the blood. It gets thicker, and glucose starts leaking out into the tissues around blood vessels. So it basically causes swelling in the tissues around the blood vessels. And this is especially for micro vessels. And the places, two of the important places where we have a lot of micro vessels are in the eyes and in the kidneys. So that's why diabetes is the number one cause of blindness, the number one cause of kidney failure, and also the number one cause of amputations and neuropathy.
And if you're not aware of what we're talking about today and testing fasting insulin, by the time your doctor figures this out and your blood glucose starts to go up, you're going to have accumulated all kinds of damage over the years.
Yeah.
So again, that ties back to what we opened up with, you thinking this is the number one health challenge right now that we need to emphasize. And the fact that you've already touched on the fact that all these different diseases spring up from this mechanism not functioning right.
Yeah. Yeah. We overwhelm the body. So the whole world is obsessed with blood sugar. They treat diabetes as a blood sugar problem only. And the treatment is to either give people more insulin when they already have way too much. That is the problem. Like they have too much, so let's give them more. Or they give you some medication to induce your body to produce more, because they're only looking at the blood sugar aspect of it. So yes, blood sugar is a problem and insulin is another problem, but the insulin goes on for 20 years before the blood sugar is a problem. And treating the blood sugar with more insulin just compounds the problem. And there is only one way out of this, and it's to dramatically educate people and change lifestyles, and to go on stopping processed foods, doing low carb foods that don't jack up blood sugar, and to do intermittent fasting, fewer meals that don't jack up blood sugar and insulin. And the body responds amazingly well. I've had on my channel, I've had tens of thousands of people who say they've lost 100 pounds and they're off all their medications. And And it wasn't some magic pill they did. They just stopped eating junk. They started eating real food. And what you find when you eat real food is you don't need 6 meals a day. You don't need snacks. Your body doesn't even want them.
What I am happy is coming up early on in the conversation is this hope piece. Because somebody thinking to themselves, I'm likely in this boat, I've done all this damage. We're going to talk about those factors that you just brought up later in the interview and give people the path to work back out of this. So there is hope. Even if you've damaged your body, a lot of that can be reversed.
Yes, absolutely. And what I want to say is most people go into this because they want to lose weight. That's their primary concern. And I want to say that for most people, they're going to lose weight also. But even if you don't, it's still worth doing it because some people's bodies are super stubborn, but you can still reverse your health risk markers without shedding significant weight or even a single pound. So if you go on a diet, if you are diabetic and you have really stubborn weight, there are some people who can do everything right or seemingly right, and their weight is still stubborn. But in a relatively short time, they can still bring down their inflammation. They can still bring down their A1C. They can bring down their insulin. They can dramatically lower their risk markers. So focus on those first. But some people, they're just so focused on the weight that if it doesn't, they hear about this case where someone drops 100 pounds in 6 months and they think that that should be me as well. And they wonder, what am I doing wrong? Well, you could have the deck stacked against you in that sense, but it's still worth doing. Look at all the other risk markers, and you can dramatically improve your health, even if the weight is still stubborn.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
Basically, everything else you can think of gets worse with insulin resistance. That's why it's the #1 health problem. And we've never seen anything like it where the